Go.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest in our series of Friday Acquisitions Hangouts, brought to you by the Association of University Presses and its Acquisitions Editorial Committee. My name is Geeta Manaktala. I'm the editorial director at the MIT Press, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Today, we're going to talk about the role of sales and selling in book acquisitions, and we have a great panel to unpack this topic for us. I'm going to introduce them in a minute, and I will ask each of them to speak briefly about how sales and selling figure into the work that they do. That should leave us about 30 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, use the YouTube chat box to send it at any time during the next hour. How sales and selling figure into the work that you do. That should leave us about 30 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, use the YouTube chat box to send it how sales Sorry about that. Okay.
Now you're back.
Okay. So we're talking about the role of sales and selling. It's still getting. Let me try one more time. If you want to ask a question. No, it's still doing this.
I don't think I have it open.
Does anybody have the? Okay. Let's try one more time. Feel free to ask a question at any time during the next hour. We'll do our best to answer. Please include your name and your affiliation so that we can credit the question and address you in the response. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Clark Whitehorn. Clark is executive at the University of New York. He acquires in the area of natural history, bilingual children, U.S. and Latin American, cooking, ethnohistory, and
I don't know what problem I'm causing here. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Clark.
We can hear you.
Okay.
All right. I'm gonna everybody else, but I'm wondering if there's anything we can do I'm gonna try something at my end.
Yep, I think that worked.
Did that work?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So let me just continue and introduce next Margo Beth Fleming. Margo is senior editor at Stanford University Press. She acquires books in the areas of business and economics, a list that she's been instrumental in building for the press during her 10 years there. Margo has 14 years of experience in publishing, and she has acquired many of Stanford's best-selling books. Next, I'm very pleased to introduce Gary Dunham, who's director of Indiana University Press. Gary's a publishing veteran who previously directed the publications division at the American Speech Language Hearing Association. And before that, he was director of the SUNY Press and the University of Nebraska Press. Finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Greg McNamee. Greg is the author of numerous books, including the forthcoming Tortillas, T-Swin, and T-Bones, A Food History of the Southwest, which is coming out this fall from the University of New Mexico Press. Greg has seen the negotiation process from both sides because he has also been an acquiring editor at a university press. From 1981 to 1985, he acquired for the University of Arizona Press, and then he became its editor-in-chief, a position he held until 1990. During his time at Arizona, Greg worked with authors including Charles Bowden, Nancy Mears, and Richard Shelton, among others. So before I turn this over to the panelists, let's just say briefly what we're talking about when we talk about selling and acquisitions. Selling, of course, can refer to the exchange of goods and services for money. That's the common definition. Selling can also mean the act of persuading someone about something. Now, a lot of us work with exceptional salespeople, true sales representatives and sales managers who know a lot about both of these aspects of selling. They know about moving product, and they know about how to be persuasive. They know how to talk about books, their relevance, their audiences, their readability, and their content. And it can be argued that we have a lot to learn from our actual colleagues in the sales division. It could further be argued that all of this persuasion starts pretty early in the value chain, actually with authors and with their editors. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask you first, Clark, to tell us about sales and selling in your work as an editor.
All right. See if I can unmute. Does it sound okay now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, all right. I want to talk about sort of the idea of what an editor is. And I think it starts for all of us at the very point where we begin in publishing, where we have to reconceptualize our very identity. And that is that we are a salesperson. We begin there. And I think this is often lost in university press publishing, where there's a discussion of the separation of roles. You know, sales and marketing is here, editors are here, business is there. And in the reality of our daily lives, we are selling something. And there are 5 key areas. And it starts the first time you interview for a job, you're trying to sell yourself to a press, convincing someone that you have the skills and ability you acquire for the press to represent that imprint in a positive and effective way. And so you are a salesperson from the moment you say, gosh, I'd like to work for Indiana or New Mexico, MIT, Arizona, wherever it might be, Stanford. You've made a decision to sell yourself. And I don't mean that in the way of selling out, but you are presenting yourself out there. And so you start there. And from that moment where you represent the imprint, you know, it may be a logo on your shirt, whatever it is, you represent that imprint and the books and the authors. And the second step where you begin to sell something is at a conference, or when you meet with an author, you read a proposal on email, you're convincing an author again of the value of your imprint, the value of what you do, because we've had this discussion. We are the value added in university press publishing. It's more than just flinging something at the wall and saying, oh, here's a book, we produced it, it's come get it. You got to do more than that. And that is part of that step with the author and convincing the author, and Greg will get into this a little bit, that we're worthwhile, that we add something to what you're doing, whether it's an academic book or a trade book. And the third and fourth steps might be interchangeable. You could switch them around depending upon the size of the press. But the first idea is that all of us answer to a university press committee, a press advisory board, some version of a faculty committee. And we're trying to convince them of the author's value, the book they've produced. So you are selling an idea to them. It might be purely on a scholastic level, but it might be, you know, we have many trade authors, and we would say, here, this will sell. Here's why it will sell. This is why it's a good addition to our imprint. You know, those of us at a regional press, something like, you know, our book, our bilingual children's book on Navajo English. This makes sense in New Mexico. It works for us. It has a value. So I have to convince the faculty committee of that. But the other idea that's related is internally, you do have a marketing and sales department. You have to convince them that this is worth their time, that it will be, there will be some sort of audience out there. And this applies to open access books as well. And you might ask, well, they're free. We don't have to sell them. We put them out there. There are billions of pages on the internet, many with pictures, which, you know, draw people to them. And you have to convince someone that your text is worth approaching. So you have to sell that idea that your open access is worth contacting. Otherwise, it's just a few more megabits out there in all that swamp of text online. So you're selling something, and your marketing department has to know why it's of value. Why can we sell this? Who will approach this? You know, it's important. And then there's the follow-up sales, and this is Gary's going to talk more about this. but you have to then, most presses have a year, you know, a post-publication review. Maybe it's a year out or 3 years out. How did your book sell? Now, this is where you often find yourself in a position where you walk into a director's office and he or she's looking at you and said, this sold 287 copies. You were thinking 1,500, 2,000. Could you tell us what happened? This is when your real salesmanship or womanship comes into play, because you're trying to convince them that that 287 is value added to your imprint. It was a scholarly contribution. But you have to be careful with this argument, because manure is a contribution to the environment, but in the right time, at the right place, in the right quantity. So you have to remember that you may be shoveling some manure to your boss, but again, it's salesmanship. And so you have to take advantage of that. So I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Mark. All right, Margo. Tell us about sales and selling.
All right, yeah. Thanks, Clark. I'm going to pick up on part of where you've left off, which is to say that I completely agree that the role of acquisitions is, you know, sales. And yes, as university press editors, we get to act oftentimes as our own agents. We get to act as our own developmental editors. We get to be sponsors for a project. We see it all the way through, right? But that that role of selling, right, is essential to our function. And so thinking about that and thinking about, you know, what I would have liked to hear from somebody earlier in my own acquisitions career, I've come up with 4 points that are really based on the way that I approach sales in my day-to-day practice. So the first is that, you know, when you're selling, you have to have a story. And as Clark said, you know, sometimes that's about manure, but I would say that story is strategy, right? And I've actually even published a book about this. And it's really important that you are able to present a credible story about who you are as an editor, you know, what your list is, what the press does, why it's distinctive, right? Where you've been and where you're going. And I think that credible piece is really important. For me, that's where the notion of data comes in. And so much of the time when we think about data, we're thinking about stats. But really, if you expand your thinking and you just think about data as sort of grounding, then that gives you a real great framework to start thinking about the way that you might sell. What have you done? What does your list look like at the point that you're entering, or the way that you're developing it further, right? And from my perspective, this applies regardless of where you are in that process. Before I came to Stanford, I worked for Sage Publications, where I worked on their research methods list, which is 40 years old, and a flagship program for the press, right? Especially at the time that I was there. Haven't continued to track it, but I still see those little green books in lots of offices. The tradition continues. But then I came to Stanford and I started working on a very young business and economics list. The challenges in telling the stories of these two lists were very different, right? In one case, I was looking to see what were we getting and where did I want the list to be going. And in another case, I was really, you know, trying to build something with 60 published books to point to. But in any case, this notion of the signature story, I think, is really key. And that story gets recycled, right? So when you're talking about convincing your internal departments, right? Convincing your sales team, your marketing team, your director, if they're hearing the same story from you again and again, and it's grounded in something that they can point towards, even if it's not yet a physical book, right? Maybe it's the people who you're prospecting. You know, maybe it's an area where you can be, you know, the leader because it's an area that's developing and hasn't yet taken off, but you continue to point that direction, then I think that you know, that's really meaningful. And then based on that signature story, I would encourage people, and this is my second point, to develop metrics. And the way that I do this is I just get curious about something related to the list. An author asks me a question, how long does your peer review process take? right? And I look at the last year and I see what it is, right? In the time that you've been in the press, how many of the press's bestsellers are you responsible for? These questions come up. Sometimes they're just my own passing curiosity. Sometimes they're coming from my very savvy business and economics authors, right? But whatever the case may be, I think that can lead you down the road of a little bit of research that has to be fit in. It will never be your highest priority, but if you keep it on your to-do list and you mine it slowly, then you will, come up with those metrics that then perhaps you aren't sharing in written form, or you aren't, broadcasting widely, but they're things that you can pull out of your back pocket. And those questions that stick with you and that you end up researching, they're often the questions, that are going to come up again and again. So that's number 2. 2 more things. I'm going to try and, I hope I'm doing okay on time, fit in here. When I was at Sage, I worked for a very senior editor with a somewhat salty personality, Jerry Westby, who's wonderful, criminology editor. And he said to me sort of offhandedly in an early meeting, Margo, a good book is a book that sells. And I thought, I so disagree with you, Jerry. But over time, I've come to feel that what he was really saying is that as an editor, the thing that you can do to make the book sell is to make it good, right? And yes, I think that when the book is good, it really helps in terms of the sales, right? And so that's something that I think you can use as a mantra in talking about the market with the author up front, in reminding them, that it's better to write for a smaller audience and to really give them something that's valuable than it is to try and, write for everyone, including my mom by the pool. Sometimes if, somebody is really outfitted to write for, a book that could appeal to my mom by the pool, that is the potential of their work, right? But to think about sales, I often find myself reminding people these days that somebody's going to have to forfeit 5 cups at least of fancy coffee in order to read their book. So how do you justify that? And then last of all, and I think that this comes up in relation to the point about a good book that is a book that sells, and also about the coffee, right? You have to do more, I think, when you're presenting a book internally than to just tell me about the book and why it's good. I want to be pitched. I want to be pitched like, I'm in the room for the buzz panel at BEA. I want to be pitched like whatever the book is going to be, the next big hit of the season. I want to know why a project is exciting. I want to know about the comps, and I want them to be recent. And I want the strengths and challenges that I've fleshed out in that signature story, or that you have, if you're my colleague, to inform what I'm hearing. And I think that if you take that on, if you're not just presenting, but you're pitching, when you're talking to your internal clients, really, that you can build trust, right? Because especially with sales and marketing, they know that you're thinking about that back end of the process. It's not just about filling your pipeline with books and doing the acquisitive role that you're charged with, but doing it really mindfully and thinking about that overall strategic plan. So I'll pass it back to Gita.
Thank you so much, Margo. I want to see what Gary has to say about sales and selling in his work as a director. And Gary, feel free to respond to anything that Clark and Margo have brought up.
Okay,
they brought up some very interesting points.
Yep.
About pitching, about the so what test as a 5 cups of coffee test, about and so forth. So we'd love to hear.
Clark, yeah, you have to stay mute. I would say that I have been in this business for a long time, and I've had editor after editor sit in front of me, and they're really passionate about their books, which I love. But I would say it's wonderful for me to see an editor who's been working on a book for 3 years, a year maybe, and they're really excited about the book. They feel like this book is going to make a difference. And that kind of passion is wonderful. And I love that kind of enthusiasm. And I think you need to bring that to every discussion that you have about a book within the press. I think it's important to inspire your colleagues about your vision for the book, but that's only a part of it. And when I'm sitting down with an editor and they're explaining a book, my mind is thinking about some other things as well. And I think if an editor can own these parts of the process, they're really going to sell their book well inside of a press. First of all, you really need to know the sales for the last 3 years in that area of those kind of books. Own those sales trends. The information is fairly easy to find. I really want to know that you've thought about the marketplace and that you really have a sense of the sales history of that type of book. If it's a part of a series, that series as well. That's number one. Number two, I think that you have to have a real sense of what you think is going to be the press's return on investment on that book. How much you think we're going to make on that book? And it may be that we're not going to make a lot on that book, but I want you to be aware of it from the start. You need to convince me that you've thought about that financial aspect. Yes, we're not all just about money, but you need to take that part of it seriously. And if we're not going to make a lot of money on that book, we'll be talking about other parts of this that will make money as well, so that we can see a balance overall with your list. Number three, I want a realistic sense of audience. And I know that when I started at Nebraska, one of my first meetings with the editor-in-chief there, I was talking about, basically a worldwide audience, and everyone was going to love my book and so on. Well, that was kind of stupid looking back. And I think it's really important that when you're putting on the marketing hat as an editor, and of course you've been talking to your author about it from the start, be realistic about it. I think probably the most common problem and challenge I see for editors is when they're trying to talk about how a book can be used in a classroom. They use the word textbook an awful lot. Well, that's not the same thing as having a book used as a secondary course adoption. And I think we need to distinguish between a variety of ways that a book can be used in a classroom. That's going to impact sales, it's going to impact the marketing strategy, and so on and so forth. So audience is very important. The fourth thing is I want to know before you walk in that room that you have a commanding vision of your list. And I want to know, and that's, in a sense, talk about the narrative that spins together all the books that you are working on and that you have worked on, and that you have a strategic vision that you've shared with your colleagues for where you're going to be taking that list for the next 3 to 5 years. Because that vision of that list will sell the book for you more than you yourself, because they're already going to know how that book that you want to pitch fits in with your master plan. Very important. I can't stress that enough. And we talk a lot about that here at IUP. And lastly, we all know that we don't operate in a vacuum. Every book that you acquire, that you've worked on for years with an author, is going to impact your colleagues at the press. And if it's got special things about it, it's a long book, it's got a lot of illustrations, I want to know that you've done your legwork within the press, that you've shown respect to your colleagues by talking to them about what the impact is going to be, both in terms of their workload and in terms of the costs before you walk in the room and speak with me. So those are really the main 5 things that I'm looking for. And that's it.
Very helpful. Thank you so much. Greg, let's hear from you next about your experience as an author, as well as an.
Well, thank you, Geeta. A dozen years or so ago, I pitched a book proposal to a major trade house in New York, working with an editor now deceased who really deserved the adjective legendary. She had a lot of influence, and she took the proposal, which was for a book of literary travel that would have put me in southern Italy for a year or so, and brought it before the editorial committee. And everybody loved it, it seems, except for the marketing people, because as all editors and all authors know, marketing people hate everything. And they think everything is doomed to catastrophic failure. And perhaps they're right about that. But anyway, the editor-in-chief of this house got back to me and said, we think this is going to be a great book. but we don't think it's going to be a big book. Can you convince us that it will be a bestseller? And I thought about that for a while, and I thought, well, no, I can't convince you that it's going to be a bestseller. You know, that's way beyond my control. I couldn't muster the necessary fantasizing that would have put the book on the charts, I guess. So I've written a dozen books since, and none of the publishers has asked me to do any of that hyper fantasizing about sales potential. But even so, when I pitched them, I gave careful thought to who was going to buy the book. And in my proposals, I've specified that each of the books would have identifiable audiences that I would try to go and find, and that I could and would work hard to reach. Some of those books have indeed found audiences. A couple didn't work as well as anybody might have hoped, much as we tried, much as we exercised all the ingenuity we could. And by we, of course, I mean the publisher in partnership with the author. Doing things like marketing in untraditional ways. One book that I worked, one book that I wrote went out onto the shelves of a chain of hipster books, hipster clothing stores, kind of as decorations, places where guys with big beards buy their flannel shirts, and didn't quite work. In another case, I identified, maybe not wishful thinking, but as potential audience, I identified a national park where 6 million visitors came every year, and I reasoned that if just 1 in 1,000 would buy my book, then that's 6,000 copies a year. The book came out, but the sales rep never got it into the park bookstore, so it wound up selling not so many copies, and in fact, the publisher went bankrupt. Not long after that. I take pride in being part of that bankruptcy. On the other hand, a book that I recently came out with has done much better than that book, also pitched to national parks. And so I guess you just never can tell. I don't know any writer who's indifferent to questions or considerations of the marketplace, but I know lots of us who are kind of baffled by the prospect of how to get books out into that marketplace. And the reality, at least in my experience, is that the writer himself or herself has to really get out there in the trenches and hand sell the book, copy by copy, reader by reader, to audiences that have to be sought out through due diligence and endless hard work. You know, you have to get out in public, you have to give talks, you have to give readings, get in the newspapers, on television, penetrate all the layers of noise that surround us in order to get your book known. And that's not at all easy. Some writers are very good at it. I think of the poet Joy Harjo, for example, who blends readings with jazz performances, and after that she sells truckloads of books. It's really quite amazing to watch. Another friend of mine, Craig Childs, nature and outdoors writer, puts on multimedia shows about river rafting in South America and other such adventures. And it's the next best thing to an IMAX theater. And he, again, sells books by the truckload. As for me, I'm always out on the road trying to do the same thing, trying to get those truckloads of books to move, trying to find those elusive readers. One of the terms that came up here was about branding, and I don't like to think of myself as a brand particularly, but I do like to imagine myself paying the mortgage 5 years from now, and writing a saleable book is one ingredient of that, but so is getting out there and selling that saleable book. It's part of the author's responsibility, as much as the press's, to reach audiences wherever they can be found. And in the case of the book that you cited, my newest, that Clark has kindly published, those readers are going to be found in hamburger shops and Mexican restaurants as much as they are in bookstores. So as Geeta said, way back in the last century, I worked as an acquiring editor, and I know the travails and disappointments and heartache that acquisitions people experience every day. I try not to add to those heartaches, and I guess that's really the thing that authors can do. My prevailing theory when I was publishing was you never can tell whether a book is going to work. You never can tell whether it's going to hit or not. The only way you can find out is to publish the thing, you know, and if it's any good at all. And so I think authors can do a lot to convince editors to take that risk by being very honest in assessing not just the market and where the readers are, but also their own expectations for the book and what they think is going to happen to it and what they're willing to do to make that book work. And then to get out there and sell the damn things. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. So a lot of interesting stuff has come up in our conversation thus far. I think we'd like to take some questions now. We have a few questions already, and I will turn to those in a minute, but let me remind you that you can use the chat box in the YouTube screen to send us questions. Feel free to direct a question to a particular panelist if you wish to, or to all of us. And please be sure to identify yourself so that we can attribute the question to you. I see a question here from Walter Biggins from Georgia, who asks, how do you adjust this sales narrative when talking to different constituencies? How is selling a book or a list to potential authors different from describing it to editorial boards or to potential donors? That's a great question. Who would like to jump in on that one? The question of audience has come up a lot here. And I think the answer has something to do with audiences. And thinking about audience is a critical aspect of selling. So I think you were going to talk, Clark. Go ahead.
See if I can do this without causing chaos here. I think in regards to Walter's question, and I'll speak to the issue of donors because there's a lot of pressure to subvent our scholarly list, is your message is very much targeted to their mission statement, how this book fits their support. I mean, and that's critical because when it comes to your faculty committee, it's very much targeted to why this book is of service to the imprint, why it represents the university in a positive and effective way. And generally, I can only speak for our faculty committee, but we don't have right now a single trade author on our faculty committee. And so it's almost always geared towards a scholarly contribution argument. You know, and when we do bring up, you know, we have a lot of regional trade, whether it's weaving or cooking restaurants, whatever it might be, then you have to sort of point out it makes money. Because then they'll sort of say, okay, well, if it's making money and it's been peer reviewed, we'll okay it. So it becomes, I think that's the trick on Walter's question, is just being very clear, you know, of who you're targeting, because you do have to adapt it. I mean, that's my sense anyway.
I have the same experience in terms of the editorial board, that they're, you know, our editorial board is, well, you know, we have a range of people on the board, so they vary, but I would say that the goal is, of course, to show that the book is worthy of the Stanford imprimatur, right? That it has that rooting in research, regardless of how tradey it is, right? And when it is a scholarly book, that it is a significant contribution. So I think that, you know, I can second that in terms of the focus on the board, but I do think it's also important to think about a consistency across the strategic story that you're telling. You might, you know, put makeup on the face of that story depending on who you're going out with, but I think that consistency is really important, both internally and externally. So much of selling is about building trust and a rapport with whoever that customer is. Whether it's an author or a book buyer or somebody who's going to be an informant or a supporter for the list. So I'll just add that.
Great. I want to move on, if we can, to some of the other questions. Sandy Thatcher has a question about selling a marketing and sales department on giving a book you're sponsoring a trade discount. What arguments and evidence do you use to make that case?
I'm curious to perhaps hear what Gary has to say here.
Me too.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. I know that I've had editors in the past who say, it's got to be a trade discount because we can get into as many venues as possible. Well, I need hard evidence. I need to see information about books like it in terms of their sales history. And we need to be talking about audience in very specific terms. That's part one of the discussion. Part two is going to be that I want to hear from the marketing folks as well to say exactly the same thing. And if there is a difference, I'm going to side with the marketing team.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. Anyone else on that one? Okay, Greg Britton from Hopkins has a question. He says, I'm curious about external data. What data are editors using predictively and where are they getting it? So another aspect of sales and acquisitions is using sales data to inform what we publish and what we offer for it. So Greg's question is getting to that side of the sales question. Where are we getting data about sales and how are we using it?
I mean, I think we all have access to the same tools that we can subscribe to, right? So, you know, it's not revolutionary to say, look at BookScan. In terms of my own practice, I would say that there are two things that might not be top of mind for an editor. The first is, rather than waiting for like a birthday report, which Clark was talking about a little bit earlier in the conversation, I look at data for how the books are doing ongoingly. So if I'm having an email exchange with an author, I might not report sales to them, but I just look. And so that way it's more organic. And then the other thing is that I use Amazon so much. And yes, it's not reliable, right, in terms of what the sales ranking is, but it is triggered by what people are buying just then, right? And oftentimes, if I'm putting together a contract proposal, that's interesting to me. And I have in my own mind, you know, classified, what does it mean if it's in the top 100,000, right? Paired then with customer reviews. I'm curious to see how Amazon Charts continues to develop. And, you know, I, like all publishers, have mixed feelings about Amazon, but I would say that when it comes to that research, you know, that's my first stop.
Margo, is there, or anyone else, is there any kind of strategy we can build for Amazon to improve our rankings and improve our stars and our ratings on Amazon? I know none of us would ever think of gaming the system, but what's an appropriate strategy for appearing higher up in the search results via metadata, or having more starred reviews, or what really makes a difference in terms of Amazon?
I want to know. Yeah.
I'd ask Greg. Greg, do you ever pay attention to Amazon and sort of your sales?
I don't really, Clark. Because as Margo suggested, I think there's a lot of gaming within the system. I worked for Amazon 100 years ago when they were first getting going, and have a little bit of insight into that. And I do use it as a means of sort of, as I believe Margo also said, guessing at where things are in any given moment, at what topics are of interest out there. But generally speaking, no, I don't really use it.
Do others use BookScan? Margo mentioned BookScan. And if you do, what's the multiplier for BookScan sales, which always seem to be somewhat lower than our overall sales for a title, but how much lower? And why does that vary so much, title by title?
I mean, just to jump in for business books, I can tell you that there are a lot of direct sales, right? There are a lot of bulk sales. There are, you know, adoptions that are non-traditional, like sales to executive education, right? Where everyone in the course gets the book, right? And none of those are going through channels that BookScan is counting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's perhaps in part why, the Amazon sort of test of whether something is trending is interesting in a different way, right? Because that you have to use a multiplier with these other services. So.
Okay, great. We have another question from Ana Jimenez Moreno from Georgia. She asks, does the prestige of the author carry its own currency within the department? And so this is about presenting a book, selling a book internally. How does the author's reputation figure into that?
I've used it as a tool to talk to a colleague and to say, author X is significant. This is the list of his or her publications. The name alone will get you X number of library sales and so forth. But anybody who's been in this business a while knows that, if you publish fiction and it's a second novel, it's almost guaranteed the sales are rarely as good as the first. I mean, we're not all J.K. Rowling out there. So it's, likely that first one really attracted attention because they did something unusual or creative. And then you see that fall off often on second novels. So usually a lot of sales and marketing department have learned the hard way to be skeptical of name. Because I think that's been my experiences. Whenever I've used it, I wait till they're on their third or fourth book and say, look, this is someone who they pay attention to. I track classroom adoptions. I sort of put that out there. But I think that's my sense on that, is it's sort of I don't want to say a weapon, but I'll try to use it that way, honestly.
I mean, I would distinguish between prestige and platform, right? And I think that this is a conversation that's relatively new to university press publishing. I think it's a conversation that's, trending in general in publishing, right? How willing is an author to get in front of their book? I'm smitten with Gregory now as an author, given his willingness to get out and hand sell. That is so influential, and getting a sense authentically of how willing an author is to stand up in front of their book, and also what their potential in terms of reaching people at the sort of start, at that acquisitions point, might be. I think that is, interesting, notable, persuasive. I also think, that in my dreams, right, we as presses can do something to foster that development of one's network over the course of the development of their book. It's not something that I'm, working on as much as I would like, but it's something that I think about, right? Like if you sign somebody up and they have a great platform, cool. But, what about in the 2 or 3 years that their book is developing, if it's based on a proposal? Perhaps investing in them and their development is one of the best ways to, on the back end, help to influence sales. So it's a question more than an answer.
I would say, if I can jump in for a sec here, that in my heart, I am all about the first-time author who's really brilliant. That's exciting. But in my head, I am all about the senior author that will have sales with it. And I think I started my career with my heart being in more, and now it's my head.
Should have stuck with your heart, fella.
It's the director's seat. It's the director's seat, right?
All right, we have another question from the audience. How do you make sense of comparative data when each book is really its own unique thing? Is there such a thing as a comparable book with comparable sales? How do we think about that? How do we identify comps? We're not trying to publish the same book over and over again, after all. Is it really about?
I don't think that each book is its own unique thing. I think it is in terms of a scholarly argument, but from a marketing point of view and from a list point of view, if the thread and theme has been put out there by the acquiring editor for their list, you're going to see how they can be seen on some sort of similar baseline. So I would say that I don't agree even with the question.
Thank you, Gary. I'm going to go with that as well. I mean, you know, in fiction, we accept this, right? When you're reading for pleasure, but in nonfiction, where, you know, a good majority of university press publishing lives, you know, maybe we don't, but it's not a bad thing, right? And I think that gets back to what Gary's saying about, you know, about classing these books.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in because I've been waiting for Gary to say the wrong thing. Been looking forward to this because he's so wrong on this. Every book is a creation. When you're dealing with the author, I understand there's internal arguments you make, but that book, as you're trying to sell, again, comes back to selling your press, selling your services as that value-added person in the process. It is a unique entity, and you need to be able to. Let's say I have a list, Latin American gender studies. Does okay for us. There's a lot of interest, a lot of classroom adoptions. And I'm obviously going to reference other Latin American gender works, but I might have a work dealing with Maya women. I might have another dealing with Oaxacan runaways and issues of, you know, sexual assault or something like that. Within it, there is a unique characteristic. And I have to be able to make that argument, as Gary, as you pointed out, of knowing where precisely is the interest going to lie here in this particular book, whether it's, say, Mayan beauty queens versus Oaxacan runaways. I need to be able to distinguish, even though they are generally Latin American gender. So I would argue uniqueness. I'll let you talk.
Yeah, because I would say that you need to step back from the book and you actually have to look at it in terms of the marketplace. You have to look at your book from the viewpoint of a marketing person who, of course, is going to take into account some of the individual characteristics and strengths and weaknesses of that book in being able to come up with a marketing strategy. But overall, they market lists as well. You know, then that's how we build lists. And there are threads of continuity throughout those lists. And I think that's our responsibility as acquiring editors to be able to look at them both at the same time. I think a common challenge for acquisition editors is that they get so caught up in their love, and I don't blame them, of an argument and of a story, the power of a storyteller, that they don't step back and let enough of the a bigger picture be seen in terms of market forces.
I want to play Switzerland here and just say that, I mean, I'm totally with you, Clark, but for me, that perspective of thinking about the book and what is special about that particular project, that's sort of, you know, for the intimate work that comes after you've done that sell, right? So once you're in development and you're there with the manuscript and the author, you know, or maybe if you're, you know, discussing the reviews before your pitch, I think, you know, figuring out what that unique value proposition is of the project is, of course, critical, right? As Gita said, we don't want to publish the same books over and over again. But I agree with Gary in the sense that, you know, the book does fit into a list. And even if it's an offshoot of something that you've published, even if, you know, for instance, we publish in finance very selectively, right? So, you know, it's not like every day that a finance book is coming across my desk, but, you know, when we do it, why does it make sense, right? Well, an entrepreneurial finance textbook makes great sense because we're Stanford and we publish a lot of entrepreneurship. So that is an example.
If I can throw in for just a second on this issue from my perspective, because as an author, I know how to get some access to this data, the comparative data, but I don't. When I pitch a book, when I send a proposal in, I do a kind of an algorithmic thing, if that doesn't sound too fancy, like Amazon does. I'll say, you know, if you liked my proposal, or if you liked, you know, Barbara Kingsolver's last book, then you'll like my book. Try to suggest books that instead of being directly comparable in sales, I say these are books that my book ought to be shelved alongside in people's personal libraries, and to ask editors to think in those kinds of ways. I think it's a little bit helpful to come at it that way, but of course it doesn't supersede the use of good data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I think we've had some very interesting discussion here about using data in acquisitions and also about pitching books internally to our directors and to our marketing and sales staff who are going to have hard questions for us about who the audience really is and whether it even exists in the way that we think it does or at the scale that we think it does. I want to come back to an earlier question that came up in some of the editors' presentations, and that is about how to sell the press to an author. And I want to start with you, Clark, because you addressed this in your remarks. How do you surface what's most important to an author when you're making the case for publishing with your press?
Again, I almost always begin at a personal level, that I am the representative of the imprint, and sort of what you see is what you get, for good or bad. You know, if you want to work with someone who's a little hyper and energetic and will interrupt you constantly when you're talking, and you know, Gary has some experience with this, having worked alongside me for many years. But it starts at that point. It has to be very personal. Because what are there, 80,000 books a year published in this country? The competition out there, why you? Because you are that link, you are the bridge to the imprint. And so talk to them about why it's valuable to them, and then talk about, you get into that list and how your book will stand out as being unique, as opposed to a sort of just a group of books, that it's unique within your list. I think it's important because an author has to feel like in some way they're special. And obviously, again, it comes back to acquiring with intent. Make sure the book fits the list. I mean, if your director is looking askance at you going, what are you talking about? Why are you bringing in, you know, Lithuanian belly dancing for us? You know, whatever the subject might be. I mean, it's important to bring that focus and let the author know. I mean, that's how I start. Anyway.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that it's really important to know what the author's goals are in publishing a book. There's so much that you could say about a press. And to know what their interests are can really help you to gear your presentation. So I agree with Clark. I think that part of this job is letting people know you as quickly as humanly possible, so that they feel that they can trust you and that they can proceed with you on a venture, you know, that they're only going to set out on, you know, a number of times in their life. I mean, even if you publish a bunch of books, as Greg has, you know, it's just not that many. So there's that piece of it, but then I think also knowing what their interests are in order to determine what it is that you're pitching. The other thing is, I think that you can use your contract proposal meetings internally to find synergies that span the press. You know, I find that at Stanford, we're always talking these days about books that are meant to be read. We have a very strong developmental culture in our editorial group. So, you know, really taking that book to the next level, thinking again about that 5 cups of coffee test, you know, and that's something that really characterizes us as a cadre of editors, and then as you see the list develop every season as a press, and then I'm proud to represent to authors. So I think finding those things by observing yourself and your colleagues.
All right, Margo, I'm going to follow up on that question, and I'm going to ask you. Now, we know that a lot of things are important to authors. Sales are important to them. Royalties are important to them. Working with an editor that they get along with is important to them. Developmental work might be important to them. How do you trade these things off against one another, especially in a competitive situation? How are you going to prioritize? Are you going to be able to offer all of that? And if you can't, how do you figure out how to rank those things?
I mean, it's wonderful when you can offer all of that, right? But since that's not going to be the case on every book, or, you know, presses might be valuing books differently, I think you have to do you, you know. This is a pretty small community. So hopefully you're friends with, or at least good colleagues with, the people who you're competing with, right? So, you know them. You know them because you like them. You know them because you're interested in what they're producing, right? You know them even if you don't go out to drinks with them at conferences because you watch what they're signing. And so I think you have to be thinking in a particular competitive situation about what you can do with the resources that you have. And in addition to the author's goals, you know, like I've been in competitive negotiations where a paperback is really important to someone, right? If that's going to be the thing that, you know, the book lives or dies by, then you have to have that conversation internally, like, do I think this deserves a paperback? Am I willing to fall on my sword for a paperback, right? And then, you know, going back to the data, thinking about the paperback realistically. But I think you just have to force yourself to, is the bottom line. And the guiding principle should be what you can do, as opposed to sort of chasing after your competitors.
Yep. Okay. Great. Greg, you've worked with a lot of different editors, and you've been an editor yourself. So what are you looking for in a publisher? How would you rank your priorities as an author? What questions do you ask editors when you're interviewing them about a project that you need to publish?
Well, in the kind of homework that I do, I often answer my own questions on those things. But one of the things that I want to know in a house is whether the list is right for the book that I'm pitching. You know, editors are supposed to pay attention to list building and how their books fit into the general program. And I think the same thing is true. There are plenty of houses out there that are that offer decent royalties and get the books out there in a way, but that are kind of book mills and that don't do me any kind of proud when, you know, if I were to publish with them. So that's a question, whether the list is right. Another question is whether the press can get the books into the bookstores. Not that there are so many bookstores these days, but whether they make an effort to get out to the, in my instance, to the general trade or to those specialized audiences that we've been talking about. And the third consideration that I always want to know is whether the press is going to be committed to keeping the book around for a while, because almost all of my books are long tail things. Clark will tell you there's one of the books that he reissued that was published 25 years ago by a big New York house that didn't sell so well for the big New York house, but has done okay out in the world 25 years later after it's acquired its reputation and become a known entity out there in the world. And of course, the New York Trade House wasn't going to keep the book around long enough to know that. Whereas university presses are better situated, I think, to keep books alive there. But I want to know that the house is committed to that. And that's a big consideration for me is, you know, do not do an inventory reduction 2 years after this thing has been published.
Sure. Okay. Gary, before we sign off, we're almost out of time here. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to offer a piece of advice or two to the acquisitions staff in our audience and on our panel. If there were 3 things you could tell an acquisitions editor from your perspective, or an aspiring acquisitions editor, what would they be?
I think, first of all, the first time that you speak with a new author, keep in mind that this book has been inside of them and on fire for a very long time. And I think the most important way to forge a connection with an author is to ask them why they love it, why they love what they're working on. Because I think that being able to find a common ground in terms of passion and common interest is a starting point for all conversations that follow. And it also, I think, is a way to start to forge a personal connection that's based upon the common ground of the book itself. That's the first thing. The second thing, keep in mind that you don't operate in a vacuum, as I said before, that everything that you do is going to result in an investment of the resources of your organization. That's money. And it's going to be reflected in terms of investment in what you have faith in, what you've worked on, but it's also got to be showing results down the road. And it's a frustrating, weird field because we're not going to see those results for a year to 2 years to 3 years and sometimes 5 years. And so we have to be as patient as possible, have the faith that what we invested in is going to pay off, and move on to the next book before we know the success of the book that we've already acquired. Again, one of the strangest and wonderful fields that I've ever been in. Third, own your list. If you're at a university press that doesn't have a plan, overall plan for each area of acquisitions, write your own and stick to that narrative.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to stop. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and for your patience with the audio difficulties we've had. And thanks to our panelists, Clark Whitehorn, Margo Fleming, Gary Dunham, and Greg McNamee. Thank you so much also to the AUP and to John Michael for helping us with the technical support today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.